Um, hey, everybody, welcome. I'm Ed Friedman, I'm Chair of Friends of Merrymeeting Bay, and welcome to this evening's presentation on bald eagles. This is our seventh presentation this season, our 27th season of Winter Speaker Series, and we have one more to go. So, yeah, Friends of Merrymeeting Bay is a pretty unique organization, very unique in that we take a holistic look at the environment here. And while we do focus on the bay, we do venture a little more broadly in cases involving toxics or the Endangered Species Act, things like that, land protection. But our focus obviously is Merrymeeting Bay and Gulf of Maine. Research, one of our cornerstones, pieces of work, sections of work. Bald eagle breeding surveys in conjunction with IF&W and Fish and Wildlife Service, doing some of that work with Biodiversity Research Institute, for whom Chris works. Multi-year circulation study of the bay, very unique body of water here, draining about just under 40% of all of the water in Maine and part of New Hampshire into the Gulf of Maine. We've used caged freshwater mussels to determine whether or not pulp mills were still discharging dioxin, and to locate PCB hotspot, which is partly responsible for fish consumption advisory. Probably do some more archaeology this year and doing a lot with PFAS water monitoring as well. We let our research inform our advocacy generally and do a lot of work with fish, migratory fish passage, major piece of it, but toxics as well, and other things that come along that need a strong voice. Really the prime mover years ago in stopping a proposed major hydro tidal generation plant for right smack in the middle of the chops, which is what drains the bay and comes up the Androscoggin and kind of back to migratory fish. Now that COVID is more or less in the rearview mirror, we're used to it anyway, back in fairly full swing with our education program, and we'll be planning a spring bay day, May 14th. If anyone's interested and wants to help, shoot me an email or give me a call, 666-3372. Find that information on the website. But we'll be having a whole lot of kids from all around the bay outside, having all kinds of good fun, getting dirty and learning about the bay and the environment. Protected over 1,500 acres of land by now around the bay, mostly wildlife habitat, valuable wildlife habitat. That's our focus, as opposed to trails and such like that. If you think the program is good tonight and you want to watch this one or refer people to it or any other older ones we've recorded, which go back about 10 years, on our homepage, scroll down on the right under education, you'll see a link to Speaker Series videos. And the season calendar, which we're rapidly running out of next May. And these days are all the second Wednesday of the month, Wednesday evening. Linda Novak, director of Old Fort Western, will be talking about Fort Western and the Kennebec over quite a spectrum of span of years. So, Chris DeSorbo. Chris joined Biodiversity Research Institute, or BRI, in 1998, overseeing a common loon behavioral ecology and toxicology study in Maine's Rangeley Lakes region. As BRI expanded its mercury research to include other species, the Raptor program was born. Through this program, Chris initiated what's now become the most extensive bald eagle sampling and banding effort in Maine's history. And actually, I'll throw in that FOMB has probably the most extensive record of eagle nest eagle nest surveying this area in the state as well, the Eagle Shrine program. Recent BRI Raptor program projects have emphasized various studies of migrating raptors and using individual tracking technologies to inform conservation and management decision-making relevant to bald eagles, peregrine falcons, and other raptors. Chris's current projects at BRI include evaluating mercury and lead exposure in adult resident bald eagles and in common loons, and assessing mercury exposure and risk to North American migrant raptors, and evaluating the use of offshore wind energy areas along the Atlantic coast by migrating peregrines and merlins. In addition to raptor work, Chris is overseeing BRI's projects related to wildlife and solar energy development. And Chris has a BS in biology from UNH, 1996, and a master's in science, environmental studies, conservation biology from Antioch University in 2007. And with that, I welcome you again, Chris. Great to finally have you here. And you can go ahead and share your screen.
All right. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, hear you okay, and we see your large slide. So you're good to go, my friend.
Okay, good. Yeah, hi everybody. So yeah, it's funny, I didn't think about it till you mentioned it, Ed, but yeah, I probably met you in like early 2000s doing bald eagle banding and mercury work. And yeah, there's a massive gap in time between that experience and us going out again this year. So it's kind of cool to be talking now. So let's see here. So I'm going to give you a little overview of what I'm going to talk about here. What I thought I'd do is just give your standard textbook natural history primer on eagles. But as a part of that, what I'm going to try to do is work in a summary of some of the different studies that have happened in Maine specifically, because Maine actually is unique in the broader research on eagles in some ways. So I'm going to interject some detours to talk about some of the studies that have happened here, and then pivot back to talk about just the decline in recovery of eagles, because it would be you'd be remiss to not do so, and then talk about some of the more kind of contemporary issues that are that come up with regard to eagles, and then we'll kind of finish up with just some things you can do. That's the plan. So yeah, I work for BRI. You can check out that website if you wanted to learn more about us. We're a 501c3 nonprofit founded in 1998. And the mission statement of the organization is up there, to assess emerging threats to wildlife and ecosystems through collaborative research and to use scientific findings to advance environmental awareness and inform decision makers. And so, the focus is really on science, research, policy. We don't really go into the world of advocacy like Friends of Mirror-Meeting Bay does. And yeah, our outreach is a lot through our website and, just communication pieces. We have about 50 staff and about 20 or so scientific programs or centers, ranging across it's a pretty wide swath. Some of the programs are focused on regions like the tropics or the Arctic. Some of them are focused on topics like mercury, climate change, offshore wind, and some of them are focused on taxa, so things like loons, waterfowl program, mammal program, shorebirds, songbirds, and I focus on raptors, as Ed mentioned. So, basically, of all the birds in the country, eagles have always been noticed. It was interesting to me to even find a quote from Aristotle about eagles. Obviously, everybody knows they're the national emblem of the U.S. What some people may not know is that, where did that go? There we go. that yeah, Ben Franklin actually did not want the eagle to be our national emblem. He was preferring the wild turkey instead. And so at this point, I always feel like the question that somebody might pose is, we have sunken so much money and energy into studying and recovering this species. Why why should we continue to study bald eagles? And so this is my slide addressing that. There are many of them. Eagles are great barometers of ecological health. They're the quintessential bioindicator species, which many people probably already know about. There's also this this concept of umbrella species. So if you do conservation work on a wide roaming species like eagles, you're protecting a lot of other species that are within that home range. Another factor is just the important role that predators play in ecosystems. If you remove predators from systems, everything gets out of whack, and people can probably think of examples of that. And there's still, despite a tremendous amount of research on the species, a lot of things we still don't really know about them. And, one thing that I like to do is use the charismatic nature of eagles to raise awareness about important environmental issues. So river and fish restoration, people really care about eagles. Some of those people might not care as much about fish, but if it affects eagles, it'll turn some heads. And I think that's an important role that we can play here. And just in the broader scheme of the population, Maine's population specifically is regionally important. Hold on, I'm gonna adjust something here. Well, I guess I don't know how to. Okay. So natural history. Sorry, guys, I really just need to adjust something. That's better. Most people know the kind of cookie cutter things about eagles. 6 or 7 foot wingspan. They're relatively heavy bird, 9 to 13 pounds. Like a lot of the raptors, females are slightly larger than males. Northern birds tend to be larger than birds from southern states. So, if we have a Florida eagle up here, they're noticeably smaller than Maine eagles. They, can be aged, adults 5 to 38 plus years. And a lot of people, compared to a lot of the other raptors, they have a relatively distinct silhouette and flight pattern. The diet of eagles, most people have a pretty good sense of what eagles are eating. But one question that I think people don't tend to think about is, how would you study some of these questions? We're also interested in differences in diet by habitat or season or age class. And so back in the 80s, Charlie Todd, who's now retired biologist from the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, conducted a study just to figure out what eagles were eating in Maine. And this is, during the crux of, the recovery still. And so one of the ways you can conduct such a study is to go out and just collect basically what's on their dinner plate. So you can climb a tree, see what's in their nest. We did not put these fish here. Or you can collect prey remains on the ground. And so that's what he did. Went out, collected prey remains. So if you have 2 chain pickerel left jaws, there were at least 2 chain pickerel there if they're about the same size. And then you can start to quantify that information. And so interior, the findings of that study basically showed in interior Maine, it's 3/4 fish, about 16% birds, and about 7% mammals. If you go over to the coast, any seabird biologist will be quick to tell you that they're obviously not just focusing on fish as much in that environment. There's a real emphasis on seabirds, which has a lot of ramifications for things like contaminant exposure, not to mention the seabirds themselves. And so, yeah, you have about a flip here where, 76% of their diet is birds, and then a smaller portion of fish and mammals. I will say that, there's other groups. We have a ton of prey remains that we're still going through with some help from volunteers. And, there's turtles in there. There's a few other items, but that basically captures it. And I guess I will say this is a seasonal representation. In the wintertime, you have a whole shift to scavenging ungulates, for example. Eagles in interior Maine, as soon as their prey is all locked in with ice, they're going to have to pivot to something else. Eagle nests are giant. They're 3 to 4 feet across, usually 2 to 3 feet deep. And they will add sticks to those nests for many years. And, eventually those piles of sticks will become so massive that they might just take the top of the tree down or just fall out. And you can actually see these layers of different years of material on these eagle nests. Unlike ospreys, who tend to nest at the very tippy top of trees, eagles like to build their nest below the canopy, usually kind of more in the crotch of the tree. Typically, white pines are the preferred nest tree of choice, but on the coast, there's just a lot of birds and spruce trees. In some of the river corridors, like the Penobscot, they're in oaks and popples and things like that. Whoops. The thing that I found surprising the first time I got up to an eagle nest was just how flat it was. You tend to think from the ground that this is a big giant bowl and the birds are sitting down in it. It's not really the case. It's pretty flat up there, and they just tend to line sticks around the outside and then softer nesting material in the middle. 1 to 3 eggs is typical. So 2 is the typical. Much smaller proportion are 3 egg clutches and 1 egg clutches, incubated for about 35 days. The chicks are the first coat of feathers are these little white downy feathers, which eventually kind of turn into this little Don King haircut, and these gray feathers come in. And then about just after 4 weeks, these chocolate brown feathers start coming in. You can see in the lower part of that slide there, if people aren't familiar, there's some feathers in sheath. They look like it's a little waxy coating, and the feathers there's blood going to that feather, and the feather's growing, and that's what that little waxy sheath is. About 8 weeks or so, they're largely covered in these kind of chocolate brown feathers. And then full grown at about 9 or 10 weeks, but they still can't fly. And in fact, even after they fledge at, say, 12 or 13 weeks, their feathers are not fully grown on their wings. So it's a really interesting strategy. So how do you get from this, your chocolate brown standard bald eagle nestling, to this? I feel like Maine is interesting in that probably no doubt the cornerstone study on this was conducted in Maine by Mark McCullough. So you have all these other plumage variants, right? And so at some point, we're all wondering, hey, how do you how can we figure this out? So Mark, who is a retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologist focused on eagles, sought to figure this out. And so if you think about how one might achieve such a thing, similar kind of story, climbed a bunch of trees, banded a bunch of nestlings with field readable codes, and then guess what? He sat and waited on the ice in the wintertime for multiple years. This is a picture of a banded eagle out on the ice with a fish, but in Mark's study, they just put piles of prey out there and just froze them into the ice. And so, many winters spent in a blind. Eventually, you get a look at the band and you say, okay, I know who that is. That's B3. Can identify that bird. And then he was also an artist. So this is basically what came out of that. And it previously was not known before. So you don't have to get too stuck in the details of this, but the key is that in the first 3 years, really plumage is not a terribly useful way to age them, as most people think it is. The more useful indicators are the bill color, and you see the eye changes color over time. And so the base of the bill basically goes from black to yellow to the 3rd year is this sort of bruised banana look. And then, from the 4th, 5th year out, you get the white head. Breeding typically starts around 5 years. And other things you can do with banded birds, which we've done a lot of in Maine, which Ed mentioned, is you can just really start to understand where birds go, where, once they fledge from the nest, where do they end up going? And that has a lot of management and conservation implications. So this is a map we actually just very recently finished that shows where we banded eagles. This is over a roughly 20-year period throughout Maine. And what you end up with is, a marked bird like this one on the left at Portage Lake up in northern Maine. And then just a few months later, a photographer takes, a whole series of amazing photos of this bird. So now we have one piece of information about their movements. This one actually just came in on March 29th. And it's relevant to you guys because this bird was seen at the Mystic Lakes Dam in Mystic, Mass. And you can read that 62D on the band. There's also, I didn't mention, there's a silver band that we put on the birds as well. So you can see the one next to it. It's a USGS band that basically has a social security number for the bird. So if it dies, we can get a look at that band. And so that 62B bird ended up, was it B or D? 62D ended up being the topsum nest that we visited just this year. And so as I looked through the photos, I was trying to figure out which one it was. And I was like, geez, it's too bad I don't have a photo with the band showing, which is unfortunate. But it was pretty great. Turns out that silver band, you can read the last 2 digits, and that lines up with 62D. So there it is the biggest chick in that nest in Topsum by the retirement community. And if you pile all those up onto a map, we call them encounters. You get some encounters of live birds, some encounters of dead birds. This is basically what you get. So you have a distribution throughout all the New England states. There's a dot way up at the top here in Quebec. Some of them have been detected over in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, down in New York, etc. Far more encounters with live birds than dead birds, but of course, this is a function of where people are and the fact that people have amazing digital photography today. And so we get so many of these that I have a very hard time keeping up with them, actually. Another way you can look at movement patterns of any animal at this point is to use tracking devices. And one of those types of tracking devices is satellite telemetry. So transmitters that are fitted to bird are relaying location information up to satellites, which then send it down to a server that I can access and find the location of that individual. Nowadays, there's all kinds of other technologies using cellular networks and all kinds of other things. But we were specifically interested in trying to address this, what I thought of as like the black hole of the ecology of eagles in Maine and a lot of places. Is after they fledge, it's pretty hard to really know anything about them. And all of those band encounters we got are starting to tell the story, but there's still a lot we don't know about seasonality. How far do they go? Those are 2 points on a map. There's so many questions that were still unanswered. And again, these have a lot of conservation and management applications. So from about 2005 to 2013, we climbed trees at all of these locations and fitted a single fledgling with satellite transmitters. And the way we do, sometimes we do that a little differently. We might get an age on the birds beforehand. In a few cases, we would actually send two climbers up. This is Bill Hansen, who's worked for Power Company and for us for a bunch of years and also just retired. And in some cases, it's just really helpful to have two climbers because you can have one person go out the back and make sure that the bigger chicks don't fall out. It actually very rarely has happened that a bird falls out or jumps out. But if you're going to be putting tags on these larger fledglings, we want them at like, 8.5 to 9 weeks of age, as opposed to like 6 when we're doing nestling banding work and sampling work. There's just a much higher possibility that they come out. So once we bring them down to the ground, we would fit them with essentially a backpack harness. This is the tools on the left are how we used to do things. Now we just sew it on, but it's essentially wearing a backpack just like you would. It's between the shoulder blades, essentially behind the head. And so if you remember the map of the encounters as a comparison, this is kind of the scale of what you might get from satellite telemetry of those 20 individuals. And this is still actually with technology that isn't nearly as high resolution as some of the newer technologies. So this is probably something like 100,000 points, as opposed to, I think it was over 400 encounters with bald eagle nestlings. So as you start zooming in, each color that you see here is a different individual, and you can start to see, there's clearly patterns to to some of the areas that birds are spending time. You could notice this, this area right around central Maine. There's a ton of birds that are visiting that area. So we were interested in really just starting to characterize what birds are doing during their subadult years. And so are there seasonal differences? What about differences between their first year, their second year, their third year? Is there a shift over time? Eventually, we know that they come back relatively close to their natal area and settle in, but that might be 4, 5, 6 years. So if you picture laying a grid over the last map, this is a really probably the most crude approach we took, but the first one, to just take a look at what we can learn about areas of importance to Maine's subadult bald eagle population. And that sector of the population, I will say, is really important because basically, a sec here. Okay, just checking my time. So it's important because it plays a huge role in population stability. So if we can find out areas that are important to eagles, then we can start targeting conservation efforts or management efforts on those areas. So this is basically a heat map that shows hotter areas are essentially basically squares where more individuals have coincided over time. And then the colder temperatures on the map, so to speak, are where fewer birds have. So what pops out is kind of interesting. You see some areas that we know to be important. Merrimeeting Bay is in there. And so, somewhere between 7 and 9 eagles of that 20 all happen to go there. And same with the Sebasticook River, the lower Sebasticook River. We've done a fair amount of work there. It's one of the biggest fish runs for river herring. So that's, a further justification for, targeting conservation efforts in that area. Then you also have some surprises to some of us, like the City of Augusta landfill. You see a few dams where open water and fish probably pile up. But basically, that is a pretty crude way to do it. And if you really want to start getting a better sense of what the movement patterns of these birds are, we now use what people call movement models. And so this map is basically a composite of all the individuals averaged together from fledging to early winter. And these are their first few months of their lives post-fledging. So the red areas are areas they really spend a lot more time, to put it really simply. The blue lines around that is just capturing 95% of the use. And so now we have a fairly decent idea of what Maine eagles' use patterns look like. You can see the Connecticut River corridor pretty clearly delineated there between Vermont and New Hampshire. And then, of course, the whole central Maine area overlapping with the Kennebec River. There's just a lot of things going on in there. If you picture that last one, this shows what birds are doing during the winter months. So you see this huge contraction of their range. They're really just keying in on a few areas during the wintertime for obvious reasons. This is just kind of zooming in on that in the summertime. So here you go. You can see, the red areas are really the areas they're spending the most time. And you have, we didn't tag birds this far north up here, up in Caribou. But in the summertime, there's all kinds of use patterns that start to pop out. Winter range, again, in Maine, just really refined down to a few key areas. And then this is a approach that we took that you don't have to worry too much about the details, but essentially, if you overlay the use patterns of birds in their first year with birds during their second year, and then birds during their third year of life, it reveals areas that are habitually visited over time. So if they're visiting these areas habitually, it's not a coincidence, right? There's important food, roosting, resources in those areas, and that's where we then focus our efforts. And so one of those areas that popped up, and I mentioned before, is the lower Sebasticook River. This is probably one of the more important areas to subadult eagles in the state. We've had, roughly half of the eagles that we tagged just in that 20, that group of 20 basically found that spot. And so those areas are important when you have stresses on the population. So this is a pivot to talking about the decline and recovery for a little bit. So back in the 60s, there was a study of looking at comparative reproduction in bald eagle populations in a few key areas: Alaska, Florida, Maine, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And so that revealed what people had already been noticing, is that there's something going on with eagles. There's chronic problems with their reproduction, especially in Maine and subpopulations along the Great Lakes. So in 1963, a broad survey was conducted in the whole continental US. Only 487 pairs of eagles were found during that survey. So what are the reasons for that? These are in no particular order, actually. But one of the biggest reasons was just persecution. Eagles were killed. There were bounties on eagles. In Maine, they were fed to hogs. There's, a bounty in Vinalhaven in 1806. You can see these different numbers of how much you could get for the claws were the feet were really, I think, the desired item from the bounty. And so about 128,000 bounties were paid out between 1917 and 1949, and then that was overruled by federal legislation. Then habitat loss and disregard for nest sites is a factor. People were basically, disturbing, cutting down trees, etc. We also were pretty significantly impacting the food resources of eagles at the same time. So a lot of the anadromous fisheries, that some of which we see recovering a bit today, were pretty decimated back in those years. But the reason that is overarching in everyone's mind and is critically important was DDT, which is a insecticide that was broadly distributed throughout the country, and it's still actually used in some other countries today. And so I always like to show this slide as a reminder of, the messaging around things, is just good to take note of. So this was in Time magazine. Turned out to be one of the most devastating environmental disasters that impacted all kinds of species, particularly the high trophic level species, and particularly raptors like eagles, ospreys, peregrine falcons. Once a bird had depurated DDT, which broke down into this other compound, DDE, or PCB, into eggs, then it weakened the eggshells. The birds would sit on the eggs and they would break. PCBs were also a concern, and mercury was also noticed back in those early days as well. So a national recovery strategy was devised. The US is broken up into 5 regions, which each had their own monitoring plans, recovery goals, delisting criteria, and eagles were restored to some areas through hacking. So chicks were taken from some clean, quote unquote, areas and brought and hacked out in towers in some areas. So New York State is really famous for this work. In some cases, eggs were taken from clean sites and transplanted into nests in places like Maine. The key thing about the history of bald eagles, I think, is just it really demonstrates effective environmental policies. The Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, and the eventual ban of DDT. And all of these things were remarkably important in the recovery of bald eagles. So this graph shows DDT, which, again, DDE and DDT are essentially the same thing for this conversation. But it just shows the decline in DDE over time. back in the 1960s all the way through the 2000s. That bottom line is a line associated with normal productivity, essentially, and the upper line is associated with eggshell thinning. Some areas like the Great Lakes experienced deformities and things far worse than what we experience here. So this is a graph out of a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service report showing the number of pairs nationally over time. So you have, back in 1963, there's 487 pairs in the lower 48, up to 2006, where they had 10,000. I actually don't have the current number, nor do I have a graph showing it. But this was the trend in Maine's population from 1962 up to the very last statewide survey conducted in 2018. So you had 734 pairs, far more now. This just kind of shows the distribution of those pairs over time. So you can see, eventually you see the whole Penobscot River corridor getting, traced here. Coastal Maine, especially down East Maine, are pretty important. And you can see productivity, which is the chicks produced per occupied nest, steadily improves over time. So the population stabilizes, it's continuing to expand. 2007, it's removed from the endangered species list. In 2009, it's removed from the state list. And this is the last snapshot of the distribution that we had. There's still some monitoring going on, but nowhere near the monitoring that was going on all the way through 2008 and then incrementally beyond. So it's an important demonstration of a bunch of programs too, like the Essential Habitats program that IFNW has, cooperative management agreements, landowner incentive programs. Landowners play a huge part in this story, and there's a bunch of recovery goals that are outlined in IFNW's report on the recovery. So lingering issues, I felt it would be worthwhile to at least touch very quickly on some of the things that are still, of concern for eagles. One of them that we've focused on a lot, so this is going to be basically 3 quick segments on mercury, lead, PFAS. So mercury, for those who don't know, is atmospherically deposited, but there's still places like the Penobscot, the lower Penobscot River, where historic direct mercury inputs occurred, and we're still studying that today. But there's a west to east trend in deposition, and that mercury landing on the landscape gets transformed into a more toxic form, and then it works its way into organisms and then builds up across the food web. It's called biomagnification. So that pollution is actually most significant in northeastern North America. And the impacts of mercury are basically demonstrated, negative neurological and other impacts demonstrated in a wide variety of organisms. So we would go out, and when we're doing that banding work, we're really interested in collecting samples for these types of things. And the findings of that work to date are basically that mercury exposure in eagles is greater at lakes than rivers, greater at rivers than marine systems. But lake-dwelling bald eagle nestlings in Maine have some of the highest mercury concentrations in North America. There's watershed differences. Adults have much higher exposure than nestlings due to growing feathers where they dump that mercury. And the levels of mercury in adult eagles and adult feathers commonly exceed levels associated with adverse effects in other species. Haven't really figured this out in eagles per se. So, but our work to date suggests that there are some relationships between mercury exposure and productivity, but we're still working on just going through that analysis. Pivoting to lead really quickly. Lead poisoning has been an issue for bald eagles and other scavengers for decades. The problem is worldwide. This occurs in the US despite the fact that lead was banned for waterfowl hunting in 1991. Sources are variable, but the dominant source to eagles is lead ammunition. Lead is inadvertently consumed when eagles scavenge animals that are killed with lead ammunition. Lead ammunition fragments upon impact, and then eagles will go in and eat the gut piles or animals left on the landscape. And one small fragment of lead can kill an eagle. Once it's in their bloodstream, it sequesters in bone and it can be remobilized. And there's a number of studies now that link lead exposure to basically reduced resilience of populations of eagles, impacts on other scavengers. So not much has been actually studied in terms of lead exposure in Maine, though. So the majority of information we have is from wildlife rehab facilities. So if they get a bird in that got hit by a car, they'll test it for lead. Or if they get a bird in that's showing, some neurological signs or interesting behaviors, I think they might routinely test them now. Back in 2011, Steve Merzakowski from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did a study looking at lead concentrations in bald eagle livers, and 16% of those indicated lead poisoning. We've found, high blood lead levels in some individuals at rehab facilities. And I would say, some of these birds are euthanized. It's not terribly unusual. There's a seasonal pattern where the cases tend to increase in the fall and winter, fewer cases in the summertime. And so the regulatory approaches vary widely and regionally. I'm not going to get into it, but some are voluntary, some are bans. And now there are non-lead ammo alternatives that are increasingly preferred by hunters for just better ballistics and the fact that, it's not contaminating the environment. So hunters tend to be some of our strongest conservationists, and they are key to the solution. Now there are a lot of organizations out there like the North American Lead Partnership run by the Peregrine Fund, Sporting Lead Free, huntingwithnonlead.org, and Hunters for Eagle Conservation, and others that are taking this approach of trying to approach hunters with hunters to talk about this problem. Last quick bit is that we're actually working on now is just a quick touch on PFAS. We've started broaching into this with not only eagles, but loons and ospreys. PFAS are essentially these synthetic fluorinated chemicals that are incorporated into all kinds of consumer products. So firefighting foams, sludge containing biosolids. Everybody's probably heard this is a big problem in Maine. Teflon coatings, water repellent treatments, food packaging. It's in basically all kinds of things around us. There are 12,000 different compounds of PFAS, and some of them are more prevalent in the environment and biomagnify than others. And many of those compounds are linked to negative health outcomes in people or wildlife. So at some lakes, waterways in Maine, there have been fish consumption advisories issued by the Maine CDC and the Maine DEP due to PFAS exposure in fish. And there's really been very little work done in Maine. So this is literally, we've just barely finished the first look at some of this data. So I scrambled to actually put some of it in here. But we sampled 77 eagles, about 16 adults and 61 chicks for PFAS. Most of those samples were collected in recent years, but we used archive samples for a few. And basically multiple PFAS compounds were detected in all individuals sampled. So we analyzed 10. This is just a summary of 10 different compounds. And you can see essentially the blue box is just a proportional representation of this most prevalent compound PFOS. Then you have other ones like PFDA and PFNA, and all of these have a different chemical structure. The proportions are about similar between adults and nestlings. This is what the distribution of those spatial patterns look like in Maine. We're still trying to interpret what that means, but you do see some reflection of higher PFAS concentrations, or PFOS in this case, in central Maine, that is known for some of these problems. It appears that lakes are higher than rivers, but we really haven't sampled rivers as much. And we've also learned that concentrations in eagles seem to be pretty well correlated to what we found in common loons. There's a different story for ospreys that I won't go into, but it does seem like there's just different patterns in all these species depending on what habitat and what region you're in. And so off to the what you can do things. I know I'm kind of running over here. The two things I put in terms of what people can do about mercury is just be aware of some of the politics going on occasionally about mercury. The MATS rule, which is the mercury and air toxics standards, has been under some fire for a while. So, I feel like if people can just keep an eye on that and support, oppose efforts to weaken that rule, that's important for environmental health. And Senator Collins put in a comprehensive National Mercury Monitoring Act as well. I put some websites there if people want to learn more about mercury. There's a ton of information on DEP's website, Maine CDC, and ours. On the eagle front, it's kind of obvious: hunt and fish lead free. People can change their practices about what they do with gut piles. Wildlife rehab facilities actually are playing an important role here, and support some of those hunter run organizations that I mentioned before. And I feel like this last point is kind of important on that topic, just to build trust among groups and improve messaging. That's kind of the part of the problem on this. Another group that I just have to, a couple last shout outs, is the American Eagle Foundation. Does great work supporting not only bald eagle work, but golden eagles. They've supported a bunch of the work that we've done over the years, and grateful to them. The Maine Outdoor Heritage Fund has funded a ton of, I think of them as seed projects that have gotten all kinds of research up and going, including work with eagles and other projects at BRI. So, and then there's the Maine Endangered and Non-Game Wildlife Fund. IF&W has been a great partner. All the kind of typical things that people should probably already know in this group about landowners, excuse me. So I won't go into that. Anyway, yeah, I'll leave it there. And yeah, I'll take any questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris. That was great. I had a few questions, and there's a couple of things in the chat room. Let me ask just first, if I heard you correctly, when we were looking at some pictures of young eaglets, you talked about the plumage not being ready when the time came to fledge.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite get that. Maybe you could not. I mean, I know I have a hard time learning to fly. Why would they be fledging earlier than they are ready?
Yeah. So I pointed out the feather sheath that on that one picture of the nestling, and so basically they will, if you caught an eagle the week that it fledged, there'll still be part of that feather still in sheath. this great bunch of studies by this guy Gary Bortolotti went up, documented a lot of these things. And but basically, why it's that way, I guess it's just beneficial to them to get out of the nest. It's more, and they have enough feather material to fly, but their feathers are still growing.
Yeah, and as I recall, actually, even once they fledge, they're still being fed for quite a
Yes.
while, right, by
Right.
their parents. So,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, so it may be a real estate issue in part, right? Because they can push each other out once they get, you know,
Yeah.
well, at any time. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay. And then there were a couple of acronyms I saw. There was the acronym UD used in some of those population slides,
Mm,
what that meant, and then there's a BAEA used. What is sounds good.
gotcha. Yeah. Some of that stuff was on some maps that we had in some reports, and that was probably explained in the captions. But UD stands for utilization distribution. It's essentially just a representation of use that takes into account, for the models we did, it takes into account kind of space and time use. So utilization distribution is basically, you could just shorten it to a use area if you wanted to. BAEA was just the AOU, or the bird abbreviation for bald eagle. Sorry.
Okay. All right, thanks. Nick is asking here, what about lead from fishing tackle? Is that a problem too? We know it is with loons, and I'm going to guess not if it's on the bottom so much, but once if it's in a fish for eagles, for sure, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't get into lead for loons and other water birds, but there's yeah, that is obviously a big issue for those species. Um, as far as I understand, very few lead sinkers from fishing tackle are found in eagles. But I guess I would leave that to folks who are going through carcasses. In my initial kind of exploration of that, I just don't think there's actually as many cases of it.
Okay. And Nick also says it'd be interesting to overlay the toxin geodata with the maps you showed earlier for preferred roosting and
Mm,
hunting.
yeah, yeah. There's an increasing number of studies now where um, people are using movement data to look at exposure to contaminants and risk and things.
Christine asks, how is climate change affecting food resources and general eagle patterns that you might be seeing?
Yeah, for a species like eagles, they're relatively opportunistic. Sadly, you could refer to eagles as a glorified scavenger. Um, so if there's, for a lot of species, the key is in the food. If they have adequate food resources, that's the number one important thing. How climate change is going to affect the food web in all of these different areas, I guess it really would start to sort of shift over time. I mean, there's links between climate change and mercury exposure. How, every people have probably heard that Casco Bay is kind of one of the fastest warming, if not the fastest warming pocket of water in the world. So there are likely cascading effects, but it's probably on a case by case basis. And yeah, I don't know. I think if I would much rather be an eagle than a Bicknell's thrush, whose habitat is going to go off the top of a mountain and they have nowhere to go. Eagles will probably be better off than a lot of species, but it probably wouldn't take me long to come up with some impacts. But yeah, I really don't know.
Lorraine has an interesting anecdote and question. One spring, watching an eagle ride the ice floes through the chops, where the bay empties out, into the Kennebec, and fast flowing water, going downstream, standing on a piece of ice, and then leaving that and flying back upriver, getting on another piece of ice, and going back down again. You know, for
Cool.
fun, for trolling for food, or both? Do you think she didn't see any obvious, hunting or fishing activity going on? But
Yeah, that's a cool observation. I wouldn't be surprised if the bird was sitting there waiting, but it's a little more of a difficult spot for an eagle to grab prey from a ice flow. They can, they can go in the water, but they might have to swim to shore, you know. Whereas that's why, a lot of times you'll see eagles just perched up in the trees and coming down and whacking a fish. They can't really pull themselves out of the water like an osprey can. So, but yeah, I would still feel like there's got to be something going on there. It's a really cool observation.
related to that a little bit, do you have any, everyone is seeing eagles, go harass osprey and get them to drop their fish, right?
Mm.
They're good thieves. Do you have anyone watch eagles enough to get a sense of, if they're osprey in the area, is that like 80% of the time they're stealing fish versus, finding their own, or 50-50, or, uh, any sense in the big picture how much thievery goes on versus foraging on their own?
Yeah, I haven't seen any quantification of that, but I will say that, like you were kind of alluding to, there's a, there's a real consistent pattern of eagles just basically waiting for an osprey to catch a fish and then taking off after it and getting it to drop it. And there's also, clear cases like the Hog Island, um, osprey cam, that Audubon runs in Bremen area there, and Muscungus Bay is that. Yeah, I mean, eagles will also come in and take young. So um, they're no doubt an adversary for sure. How much it affects, how much of their time is spent, you know, focusing on that versus other approaches probably depends a lot on how abundant food is. If there's a huge fish run coming through and they can just stand and wade in the middle of a river and grab river herring, they probably might be less inclined to tangle with an osprey.
They're very, very opportunistic.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've seen over 300 eagles up there, on the Spastic when the fishing is good. But
Yeah.
the seals are also there, and the great blue herons are there, and the striped bass are there. So it's a great picture of what wildlife could look like with river restoration.
Yeah, no doubt.
So Nick points out that, with the eagles frequenting landfills, they must be getting a lot of toxic exposure to all sorts of, household chemicals or other junk. Any thoughts on this?
I would suspect that is the case. I would think there's all kinds of other risks in there too, of just ways to get hurt and exposure to all kinds of nasty stuff. Um, yeah, there have been some great studies down in Chesapeake Bay that actually specifically looked at use patterns relative to landfills. So it's not an unusual thing. They're up at the Presque Isle landfill and Augusta. I don't know that anybody has ever captured those birds to sample them though. So it
Mhm.
really just becomes a practical challenge. Um, yeah, I know they're in there, and there's probably some clear management efforts we could take to lessen it. It's actually come up before.
William Lee asks, what about impacts on great bill herons in the heronries? Are eagles an issue?
Um, it happens for sure. Yeah, there's a pretty concerted effort to survey great blue herons that IF&W runs, and you guys probably know about that. But yeah, eagles will have been known to cause full abandonment of some of the rookeries, and I think some of the biggest rookeries in Maine have got splintered out, and one of the reasons that were thrown out on that was that it was just eagle predation over time that just was too much for them to bear. So now their nests are just scattered. but yeah, it's probably significant. Same for, some of the seabirds. There's a lot of people hating on loons, hating on eagles. The
Yeah.
loon folks are among them too.
A couple more questions. One from Michael, watching eagles, cavort in the air, very social like when they're doing their acrobatics, over a small island or anywhere. Can you elaborate on what they're doing? Some of it's probably mating, but are they just having fun, learning to fly? What's going on?
Yeah, there's a pretty elaborate courtship that people are probably seeing if it's this time of year or a little earlier. Later on, I wouldn't be surprised if it's aggression. I think one of the things that people see in the wintertime is, two eagles kind of locking talons in the air and just sort of tumbling through the air um, out of aggression. But so, the short answer, yeah, it's both. They're these spectacular courtship displays, but there's also clearly some aggression going on depending on what time of year as well. Eagles are incredibly territorial over their turf, just like, most birds. But they'll very aggressively fight it off from any intruders. And on occasion, you'll probably see that kind of thing, although it usually just more looks like one chasing the other out.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Michael in that I've seen them so many times just flying next to each other and move for move, and again, it seems to me more like a little bit of a flight training or just enjoying on a good windy day. You see a lot of that stuff, and I've seen all ages do it. So I'm not. You'd have to convince me that it was aggression,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
territorial.
Yep.
So anyway, last question, I think. From my old friend John, who's in Seattle now, but used to live out the end of the road here and watch eagles tearing into fish from his bedroom window in pine trees. A good question here. If you could solve one or two remaining unknowns or mysteries, these are the eagles, of course, what would they be?
Hmm. Boy, that's a good question. Well, I guess there's, if you asked, you know, somebody who's really steeped in the ecology of that particular species and the data gaps, like if you look at the birds of the world account, that as far as just some of the, possibly esoteric but interesting questions, I think that's where I'd look to come up with some of those. Um, Personally, yeah, I feel like there's a lot that could be learned looking at the incidence of diseases. We've actually started doing some of this work looking at HPAI, highly pathogenic avian influenza, and then a bunch of different bloodborne parasites. I think there's a lot of interesting information in doing that kind of work that is basically wide open. There's just so many unanswered questions in that arena that have real relevance to things. So I guess I would throw that out there. Yeah, I'd have to think on it. It is a very well studied species, I will say. A lot of the stuff that we focus on, movement patterns and contaminants, are low hanging fruit for us. But yeah, their ecology, a lot of those questions have been pretty well established.
Mhm. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate it. And that was a wonderful talk. Again, for folks, this will be, Martin will have this uploaded to the website within a couple of few days or so. And if you want to steer people to it, it'll be there down on the right hand column under education on our homepage. So Chris, look forward to talking to you offline and working together again this year.
Absolutely. Yeah, I realized I should have put you in the your organization in the groups to support, but I was rushing through things. But I will put in a plug here. I mean, the work that you have done with just fisheries restoration and doing surveys, and even just facilitating work like what we've done over the years has been huge. So kudos to you for all the work you're doing. And a lot of the, I will say for sure that, yeah, a lot of the work that we did, say with contaminants in Merrimack Bay, whether it's mercury or PFAS or anything else, just wouldn't have happened without the support of your organization and your efforts to facilitate landowner permission and
No, thank you. Thank you.
get survey information. So yeah, thanks to you and
I-
the landowners.
Yeah, thank you. I actually think a few times during the talk you mentioned eaglets this year, and I think that you meant last year, because I'm not
Yeah.
sure. But yeah, so because we have yet to do some yeah, this year is yet young. And
Yes. Yeah.
we'll
Birds
be
are
doing some follow-ups on birds that we looked at last, or nests that we looked at last year, I expect.
exactly. Yeah.
So, cool. Thanks so much. I'll talk to you soon, and thank you all for joining us, and thank you again, Martin, for making it happen. And we'll adjourn. Thank you.
All right. Hey, thank you very much, you
Yeah,
guys.
and join us next month if there are any history buffs on the Eagle program. You know, come learn about Fort Western next month. Thank you.
Nice.